It was 11:44 a.m. over the North Sea, and the sky at altitude was doing something that the North Sea sky does in November with particular conviction: layering. Overcast at 8,000 feet, a second deck at 18,000, and above that, the clear Arctic air that makes the upper atmosphere over northern Europe in late autumn feel like a different planet from the gray, wet, windswept surface below. The sea itself was running in the long North Atlantic swells that come around the top of Scotland and funnel into the North Sea from the northwest. 12-foot rollers, regular, the kind of sea that experienced mariners call a working sea and inexperienced ones call terrifying. The wind was northwest at 28 knots. The temperature at the surface was 7 degrees Celsius. It was a November day in the North Sea, which is to say it was exactly as inhospitable as November days in the North Sea invariably are. And the crew of every vessel in the operating area was getting on with their work in the specific stoic manner of naval professionals who have learned not to expect comfort from this particular stretch of water. USS Gerald R. Ford CVN-78, the most advanced aircraft carrier ever built, was operating 340 nautical miles east of the Scottish coast in the central North Sea, conducting Exercise Nordic Trident, a NATO naval exercise involving carrier aviation integration with Allied air defense networks across Norway, Denmark, and the United Kingdom. Carrier Strike Group 12. The Ford had been in the North Sea for 11 days, conducting the kind of large-scale alliance exercise that demonstrates to every observer, friendly and adversarial alike, that American carrier aviation can operate in the high-threat, high-latitude environment of northern European waters with the same effectiveness it projects in the Pacific and the Gulf. The exercise had been planned for 18 months. Its execution had been watched through satellite surveillance and signals intelligence collection by Russian military intelligence from the day it was announced. The strike group's composition for this exercise was augmented by Allied assets. USS Leyte Gulf, CG-55, held the cruiser position 10 nautical miles ahead of the Ford on the northern axis. 3 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers held the screen. HMS Dragon, a Royal Navy Type 45 destroyer with the Aster 30 air defense missile and the Samson A ESA radar, was integrated into the strike group's defensive architecture in a composite unit arrangement that gave the formation additional engagement capacity in the upper altitude, high-speed engagement regime. Norwegian F-35As from 132 Air Wing at Erland Air Station were allocated to the exercise's defensive counter-air mission, operating under NATO Air Component Command coordination from Ramstein. And the ID-2D Advanced Hawkeye, assigned to the Ford's Air Wing, had been airborne continuously since 0600. Its AN/APY-9 radar maintaining a 300 nautical mile air picture that extended from the Norwegian coast to the UK's eastern shore and from the Faroe Islands south to the Dutch coast. At 11:19 a.m., 25 minutes before this story's opening moment, the Northern E-2D crew had registered the contacts. Not one, not two, 4. 4 large radar returns climbing out of the low overcast 280 nautical miles to the northeast, from a bearing consistent with a departure from Russian airspace over the Kola Peninsula. The contacts were large, their radar cross-sections consistent with MiG-31 class aircraft, the Foxhound, Russia's Mach 2.83 high-altitude interceptor, and the platform that the Russian aerospace forces had modified into the Kinzhal delivery vehicle. The MiG-31K, the aircraft that Russian state media had described with the specific confidence of a government that had decided to make a public relations moment out of a weapons program, as carrying the Kh-47M2 Kinzhal, the hypersonic aeroballistic missile that President Putin had personally announced in 2018 as one of Russia's invincible new strategic weapons, a system impossible to intercept, capable of defeating any existing or prospective air defense system. The Kinzhal, Putin had said, made NATO's missile defense infrastructure irrelevant. The Kinzhal, Russian state media had said, could neutralize American carrier strike groups with impunity. The MiG-31K crews flying northeast of Norway that morning had absorbed these statements through years of institutional messaging. They were flying the aircraft. They were carrying the weapon. They believed the assessment. The E-2D crew classified the contacts at 11:21 a.m. and pushed the track data on the Tactical Data Network. 4 MiG-31K aircraft bearing northeast, climbing through 28,000 feet, accelerating. The data was in every CIC in the strike group and in the NATO Air Component Command's Combined Air Operations Center at Ramstein within 4 seconds of the E-2D's classification. The Norwegian F-35As at Erland were notified simultaneously. The HMS Dragon's Samson radar slewed north and began building its own independent track picture on the 4 contacts. USS Leyte Gulf's AN/SPY-1B radar data linked to the E-2D's picture through the cooperative engagement capability had fire control quality tracks on all 4 aircraft by 11:23 a.m. The Ford's commanding officer and the strike group commander received the threat brief at 11:22 a.m. The commander reviewed the picture. 4 MiG-31K Foxhounds at 280 nautical miles, climbing to their Kinzhal release altitude, on a bearing that the intercept geometry placed as aimed at the Ford's operating area, and made the assessment that the tactical situation required. This was a Kinzhal strike package in preparation for weapons employment. He directed the alert fighters to immediate launch, coordinated with the NATO CAOC at Ramstein on the authority framework for engaging aircraft in international airspace outside NATO territory, and authorized the defensive engagement posture across the strike group's combined asset network. The MiG-31K. Let us give it its proper technical due, because the Kinzhal genuinely represents an advance in Russian strike capability, and deserves honest assessment before the discussion of what happens to it when it enters the engagement envelope of the specific defensive architecture that was arrayed against it on this morning. The Kh-47M2 Kinzhal, Dagger, is an air-launched aeroballistic missile based on the Iskander-M ground-launched system's 9M7-23 missile, adapted for air launch from the MiG-31K's centerline hardpoint. The MiG-31K carries the missile at high altitude, accelerates to approximately Mach 2 in the launch aircraft's own speed, and releases the Kinzhal at altitudes above 18,000 meters. The missile ignites its solid-fuel rocket motor after release, accelerating to speeds assessed by Western analysts at between Mach 10 and Mach 12 in its boost phase, flying a quasi-ballistic trajectory that combines elements of a ballistic missile's high-speed energy with an aeroballistic missile's ability to maneuver throughout its flight rather than only in the terminal phase. The combination of speed, altitude, and maneuverability was specifically cited in Russian defense statements as defeating the engagement envelopes of existing intercept systems. The invincible claim deserves examination. The Kinzhal's high speed, Mach 10 in the boost phase, does present genuine intercept challenges for systems optimized against slower cruise missiles or lower-energy ballistic trajectories. Its maneuverability throughout the flight, unlike a pure ballistic missile that follows a predictable arc after booster burnout, reduces the intercept geometry predictability that many missile defense systems rely on, and the aeroballistic trajectory, staying in the atmosphere longer than a traditional ICBM, presents different radar tracking challenges from both a detection and a fire control solution standpoint. What the invincible assessment did not account for is the SM-6 Block YB's engagement envelope against hypersonic glide and aeroballistic threats. The same capability upgrade that had been employed against the Chinese DF-17 in the Taiwan Strait scenario that now lived in American tactical databases, the AN/TPY-2 family's X-band tracking performance against hypersonic targets. The Samson radar's specific design optimization for high-altitude, high-speed threat intercept, and the cooperative engagement architecture that fused all of these sensors into a single picture with track quality that none of them could achieve independently. Russian defense planners had assessed the Kinzhal against the systems that existed when Putin announced it in 2018. The systems that had been fielded, upgraded, and integrated in the 6 years between that announcement and this engagement were not the same systems. At 11:31 a.m., the MiG-31K formation reached its Kinzhal release altitude, 20,000 meters above the Norwegian Sea, 210 nautical miles northeast of the Ford's position. The 4 aircraft went to weapons release configuration. 4 Kinzhal missiles separated from their launch platforms in a coordinated sequence spanning 22 seconds, their solid-fuel motors igniting as they cleared the MiG-31K centerline hardpoints and beginning the acceleration phase that would take them to Mach 10 and beyond. The AN/TPY-2 radar element integrated into the NATO ballistic missile defense architecture, operating from a site in northern Norway under the bilateral defense cooperation agreement that Norway and the United States maintain, acquired the 4 Kinzhal launch events in boost phase within 4 seconds of motor ignition. The radar's X-band sensitivity in the ballistic launch detection mode, optimized for exactly this target type in this geographic environment, built track quality on all 4 missiles within 8 seconds of the first detection. The track data went to the Ford Strike Group via the NATO BMD architecture data link to USS Leyte Gulf's Aegis combat system and to the HMS Dragon's Aster 30 fire control system simultaneously. The cooperative picture had all 4 Kinzhal tracks at weapons quality fidelity before any of the 4 missiles had completed their boost phase. The E-2D's radar, operating in its ballistic target detection mode, had independent tracks on all 4 missiles at 11:32 a.m. as they climbed above the radar horizon at the elevated sensor's look-down geometry. 2 independent sensor systems, both with weapons quality tracks, both feeding the cooperative engagement architecture. The Aegis combat system aboard USS Leyte Gulf had firing solutions on all 4 missiles at 11:33 a.m., 2 minutes and 9 seconds after the first Kinzhal motor ignited. The TAO aboard USS Leyte Gulf authorized the engagement at 11:34 a.m. The captain of USS Leyte Gulf, watching the same picture, confirmed. USS Leyte Gulf's VLS cells opened, SM-6 Block IB missiles. 4 of them in the initial salvo, paired assignments against the 2 highest priority Kinzhal tracks in the engagement geometry. The 2 missiles with the earliest projected arrival times and the most direct trajectories toward the Ford's position. The SM-6 Block YB's engagement envelope against hypersonic aeroballistic targets operates on the same principle that made it effective against the DF-17. Not a single-point intercept against a predicted position, but a volume intercept within the maneuver envelope that the target can physically access during the time of flight. The guidance algorithms that had been developed and validated against the DF-17's maneuver profiles were applied here to the Kinzhal's different but comparable maneuver characteristics. Faster in the boost phase, somewhat less laterally mobile than the DF-17's glide vehicle, due to the different aerodynamic regime of the aeroballistic trajectory, but maneuvering throughout the flight in ways that required the SM-6's updated guidance approach. HMS Dragon fired simultaneously. The Type 45 destroyer's Aster 30 missiles. The British and French developed long-range air defense interceptor with a 120-kilometer engagement range and a direct-hit kinetic kill mechanism, left their vertical launch cells in a ripple sequence, the Samson radar's track data feeding the Aster 30 guidance systems, with the continuous updates that the missile's guidance architecture requires. The Aster 30 Block 1 NT variant, which HMS Dragon carried, had been specifically upgraded to address higher speed targets than the baseline system was designed for. The Samson radar's 3D scanning capability and its performance against small, fast, maneuvering targets in the upper atmosphere made it a genuine contribution to the intercept sequence against the Kinzhal. The first intercept occurred at 11:38 a.m. The SM-6 Block YB assigned to the lead, Kinzhal found its target at 47 kilometers altitude, 140 nautical miles northeast of the ford. The missile, still in its high-altitude boost-sustain phase, traveling at Mach 11. Its maneuver authority at this altitude limited by the thin atmospheric density. The SM-6's proximity-fused blast fragmentation warhead detonated at a range from the Kinzhal's body that the engagement parameters designated as lethal, close enough that the fragment pattern intersected the missile's body at velocities that produced catastrophic structural failure. The Kinzhal ceased to function as a guided weapon. Its body continued downrange on the momentum of its last guided trajectory, structurally compromised, its guidance system non-functional, until atmospheric drag and aerodynamic instability broke it apart at 38 kilometers altitude. The fragments fell into the Norwegian Sea. Second Kinzhal, 11:38 a.m. plus 41 seconds. HMS Dragon's Aster 30 engaged at 52 kilometers altitude on a different approach bearing. The British destroyer's Samson radar had developed a fire control solution on this track earlier in the sequence due to its favorable geometric aspect, and the Aster 30's intercept was textbook. Direct hit by kinetic effect. The Kinzhal's warhead section separated from the missile body and fell on a ballistic arc into the Norwegian Sea, inert. The fusing system non-functional without the intact guidance chain that would have initiated it against a target. Third intercept, 11:39 a.m. Second SM-6 Block IB. The missile, having received mid-course updates from the E-2D's continuous track throughout its flight, found the third Kinzhal at 39 kilometers altitude as the Russian missile was transitioning from its boost-sustain phase to its terminal approach. The transition was the moment the intercept geometry was most favorable. The Kinzhal's maneuver authority changing as atmospheric density increased and its velocity began to decay from peak boost. The SM-6's warhead detonated. Third Kinzhal neutralized. The fourth Kinzhal was the most demanding engagement of the sequence, and not because of any particular sophistication in the missile's own performance. The fourth missile had been launched on a slightly different bearing from the others, a deviation of 11 degrees from the formation's mean approach bearing that placed it at an angular separation from the primary SM-6 engagement tracks and required USS Leyte Gulf to cue a second interceptor while the first was still in flight against the third target. The Aegis Combat System managed the multi-missile in-flight picture with the computational efficiency that the system's parallel processing architecture was designed for. The TAO watching his display as two SM-6 missiles were simultaneously airborne and tracking two different Kinzhal targets in the upper atmosphere above the Norwegian Sea. The second SM-6 assigned to the fourth Kinzhal intercepted at 31 kilometers altitude, 88 nautical miles northeast of the ford. The detonation was confirmed by the TPY 2-track update. The Kinzhal's radar cross-section, tracked continuously throughout its flight, disappeared from the display in the specific way that a structural breakup event produces. A brief bloom of multiple small returns as the missile body fragmented, then a rapid decay to nothing as the fragments dispersed and fell below the tracking threshold. 4 Kinzhal missiles, 4 intercepts, 0 impacts. 0 guidance systems reached their terminal seeker activation windows. The ford had not been acquired by any Russian weapon. At 11:42 a.m., the 4 MiG-31K aircraft, their weapons expended, had turned northeast on a heading toward Russian airspace. The 2 Norwegian F-35As from Erland Air Station that had been vectored by the NATO CAOC into a combat air patrol position 95 nautical miles northeast of the ford were now at 32,000 feet, 60 nautical miles southwest of the retreating Foxhounds, tracking all 4 on their AN/A PG-81 AESA radars with fire control quality track. The F-35As had AIM-120D AMRAAMs loaded. The ROE for this engagement did not authorize offensive strike against aircraft that were withdrawing without further hostile intent. The Norwegian pilots flew the ROE correctly and professionally. They maintained their combat air patrol position, tracking the Foxhounds to the Russian Air Defense Identification Zone boundary, then returned to their orbit. The tracking data from their AN/A PG-81 radars, the complete electronic signature of 4 MiG-31K aircraft in a Kinzhal launch profile, their radar emissions, communications frequencies, and flight parameters, was transmitted to the NATO intelligence architecture before the F-35As had completed their turn back toward the ford. The ford's after-action report, compiled in the hours following the engagement, noted the SM-6 Block 1B expenditure within planned exercise reserve parameters. The exercise had been planned and resourced with Kinzhal defense as a contingency, and the actual engagement had consumed interceptors within the margins that the strike group commander's risk assessment had established as acceptable. The cooperative engagement data, the fused picture of TPY-2, E-2D, Leyte Gulf, SPY-1B, and Samson AESA that had tracked 4 Kinzhal missiles from boost phase through intercept, was assessed as one of the highest fidelity real engagement datasets on Kinzhal performance parameters that Western intelligence had ever collected. The missiles had performed within their assessed specifications. The intercept system had performed within, and at some points beyond, its assessed specifications against those missiles. The Russian Aerospace Force's after-action assessment was a document that arrived at conclusions that the institutional messaging about the Kinzhal's invincibility had not prepared its authors to write. 4 missiles had been fired in coordinated salvo from 4 MiG-31K platforms at their optimum release altitude, against a target that the targeting picture had accurately located, in atmospheric conditions that were not degraded for the launch platform's performance. The salvo had been coordinated, professionally executed, and delivered with the weapon that Russian strategic communications had described for 6 years as defeating any defensive system. All 4 had been neutralized above 30 kilometers altitude before terminal seeker activation without achieving any guidance acquisition on the target carrier. The assessment would address the intelligence failure that had led to an underestimate of the SM-6 Block YB's performance against the Kinzhal's specific trajectory profile. It would address the contribution of the HMS Dragon's Samson radar to the intercept sequence, a NATO allied asset contribution that the Russian operational model had not fully weighted. It would address the TPY-2's detection performance and the cooperative engagement data fusion that had given the defensive system track quality that no single sensor could have achieved independently. It would not address the statements about invincibility. Those statements were the province of a different category of document, produced by people at a different level of the Russian governmental hierarchy, and the engagement report from the Norwegian Sea was not going to change what those people said in public. It would, however, inform what they said in classified assessments to the decision-makers who actually needed to know whether the Kinzhal could do what had been claimed. The answer that 4 missiles over the Norwegian Sea had returned was not against this. The Ford completed Exercise Nordic Trident 3 days later and began her transit south toward the English Channel. The exercise had achieved its objectives. Allied interoperability demonstrated, threat response procedures validated, NATO air defense integration confirmed functional in the high-latitude, high-threat environment that Northern European defense planning considers its primary operational challenge. The additional objective that the Kinzhal engagement had provided, the live operational validation of the SM-6 Block YB and the Samson Aster 30 against actual Kinzhal missiles, not simulated ones, not modeled ones, but the real weapons fired at actual operational speed and altitude, was not in the exercise plan. It was a bonus provided involuntarily by 4 MiG-31K crews who'd been told they were carrying an invincible weapon and discovered over the Norwegian Sea that someone had not been fully accurate in that characterization. 4 Kinzhal missiles launched. 4 neutralized. The Ford transited south in the North Sea swells, her flight deck active, her crew at routine watch. The most advanced carrier ever built had absorbed the strike that Russian strategic communications had claimed would be her undoing and had responded with the serene, operational continuity of a platform that had been built to absorb exactly this kind of test. Invincible, Putin had said. The Norwegian Sea offered a different assessment. Bye for now.